On Halloween night, the town of Hollow Creek locks every door before sunset. They say it's tradition, a harmless reminder of something that happened long ago. But the truth is far darker. Because 30 years ago, a masked killer slaughtered 9 people in one night, and the town buried him before sunrise. Now the letters have started arriving, and someone is reminding the survivors that the night never really ended.
Welcome to Horror Audiobook.
30 years ago, Hollow Creek experienced a Halloween massacre so brutal the town erased it from history. The killer wore no name, no face, only a mask. The police claimed he died that night. The town sealed the records. The survivors tried to forget. But this year the same survivors have received letters, handwritten, stained with something dark, each carrying the same message. Lock your doors before midnight. Because the man they buried might not have been the killer. And tonight, someone is coming back to finish what was started. This is the story of the night the town locked its doors. Chapter 1. They thought the killer died that night. They were wrong. The town of Hollow Creek had a tradition. Every Halloween night, before the sun disappeared behind the crooked tree line, people locked their doors. Not casually, not absent-mindedly. They checked the locks twice, sometimes 3 times. Windows were shut, curtains drawn, porch lights turned off. Children were called inside long before the moon rose. By 9 o'clock, the streets of Hollow Creek looked abandoned. Tourists assumed it was part of the charm, a quiet rural town that preferred candle-lit houses and horror movies to loud celebrations. But the people who lived there knew the truth. They locked their doors because 30 years ago, the night had not been quiet, and something terrible had walked their streets. It began on Halloween, October 31st, 1996. Back then, Hollow Creek had been lively on Halloween night. Children ran through the streets dressed as pirates and witches. Pumpkins glowed on every porch. Music drifted through the crisp autumn air. The air smelled like burning leaves and caramel apples. No one expected anything bad to happen. That was the strange thing people remembered most about that night. Everything had felt normal. Too normal. Later, when the survivors spoke about it, when they were able to speak at all, they all repeated the same unsettling sentence. The night was too quiet. The first body was discovered just after 10. Mrs. Evelyn Carter. She had lived alone on Willow Street, in a narrow wooden house with faded yellow paint and a porch that creaked whenever anyone stepped onto it. Earlier that evening, children had visited her home for candy. She had smiled, handed out chocolate bars, and complimented their costumes. The last group of children left around 9:45. Neighbors later said they remembered seeing a tall figure walking up the path toward her porch. At the time, no one thought anything of it. Halloween meant costumes, masks, strangers. But that figure wasn't wearing a costume. He was wearing a mask. A plain one. White, expressionless. Smooth as bone. At 10:17 p.m., a teenage boy named Ryan Wilkes ran down Willow Street screaming. He had gone to Mrs. Carter's house to collect candy for his younger sister. When she didn't answer the door, he peeked through the living room window. What he saw inside would haunt him for the rest of his life. Mrs. Carter lay on the floor beside the couch. Her candy bowl was overturned, chocolate scattered across the carpet. And standing beside her body was the man in the mask. Still, watching the window, watching Ryan. The boy ran. Police arrived within minutes. But by then, the killer had already moved on. The second body was found 20 minutes later. Then the third. By midnight, the entire town was in chaos. Sirens screamed through the empty streets. Police cars raced from neighborhood to neighborhood, but no one ever saw the killer clearly. Only glimpses: a tall silhouette beneath streetlights, a white mask turning slowly towards someone watching from a window, a figure standing silently on a porch before disappearing into the darkness. He moved through Hollow Creek like a shadow, silent, patient, deliberate, and wherever he went, someone died. By 2 in the morning, 9 people were dead. 9 different homes, 9 different victims, all killed in the same brutal, methodical way. No robbery, no message, no explanation. Just death, and witnesses all describing the same horrifying detail. The mask, always the mask. White, blank, emotionless. The town fell into silence after that. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that feels wrong. Heavy, like the air itself knows something terrible has happened. That was when people began whispering the phrase, "The night is too quiet." Because by then, everyone in Hollow Creek understood something terrifying. The killer was still out there, somewhere, walking their streets. The final confrontation came just before dawn. A deputy named Marcus Hale spotted someone moving along the edge of Hollow Creek Forest, the stretch of woods that bordered the town's northern edge. Hale had grown up in Hollow Creek. He knew those woods well. But that morning, the forest felt different. The fog hung low between the trees. The wind had gone completely still. And ahead of him, just barely visible between the trunks, stood the figure in the white mask. The killer. Hale called it in over the radio. Backup was minutes away. But the killer didn't run. He simply stood there, waiting. What happened next became the official story. The version written in police reports. The version repeated for years afterward. Deputy Hale approached the killer, ordered him to drop whatever weapon he carried. The masked man lunged. There was a struggle. Shots were fired. 3 of them. And when the echoes faded through the trees, the killer lay dead on the forest floor. At least that was the story. But the truth was far stranger. Because when officers finally approached the body, they couldn't identify it. Not easily. The face beneath the mask had been horribly damaged during the struggle. The killer had no identification. No fingerprints on record. Nothing connecting him to anyone in Hollow Creek. Or anywhere else. Just a dead man in a mask. The town wanted it over. Desperately. 9 people were already dead. The mayor ordered the case closed within days. The body was buried before sunrise. No public funeral. No investigation beyond the basics. Just a quiet burial in the far corner of Hollow Creek Cemetery. And an official statement. The killer is dead. For a while, people believed it. They had to. Life slowly returned to normal. Children went back to school. Stores reopened. Halloween decorations were taken down. But some people never stopped thinking about that night. About the way the killer had moved through town. About the silence. About the woods. And about the body that had been buried so quickly. Because even then, something about the story didn't feel right. One witness in particular never forgot. Old Thomas Bell, the town's night janitor. He had seen the body just before it was buried. And years later, when someone asked him about it, he said something strange. Something that made people uncomfortable. Something that no one in Hollow Creek liked to repeat. Thomas Bell had stared into the coffin for a long time. Then he shook his head slowly and whispered 4 words. 4 words that would echo through the town for the next 30 years. What if that wasn't him? Hollow Creek buried the killer anyway. Buried the questions. Buried the memories. And for 30 years, the town pretended the nightmare was over. But every Halloween night, before the sun went down, people still locked their doors. Just in case. Because deep down, everyone in Hollow Creek knew something. A feeling they never spoke out loud. A quiet fear that never went away. The same one that had lingered in the air that terrible night. The same one people still whispered when October returned. The night is too quiet. And 30 years later, the letters began to arrive. Chapter 2. The letters arrived exactly 30 years later. October returned to Hollow Creek the way it always did. Slowly, quietly. The first signs were subtle. The leaves began to turn brittle and orange. The wind carried the smell of damp earth and wood smoke. Porch steps creaked under colder mornings. But for the people of Hollow Creek, October never felt like just another month. It felt like a countdown. 30 years had passed since the Halloween massacre. Most towns would have moved on by then. Hollow Creek never did. The older residents still lowered their voices whenever the story came up. The younger ones only knew fragments, rumors whispered by parents who insisted the details were exaggerated. But everyone understood the tradition. Lock your doors before Halloween night. Just in case. The first letter arrived on October 3rd. It appeared in the mailbox of Alina Briggs, one of the few surviving witnesses to the massacre. Alina had been 22 when the killings happened. Now she was in her 50s, her hair silvered by time and worry. She lived alone in the same narrow house on Oak Street, where she had lived her entire life. That morning, the sky hung gray and heavy over Hollow Creek. Alina stepped outside to collect her mail, wrapped in a thick sweater, expecting nothing more than bills and grocery flyers. But one envelope stood out immediately. It was yellowed, old-looking, and there was no return address. Her name was written on the front in dark ink. Not typed. Handwritten. Slow. Careful. Almost deliberate. Alina stared at it for a long moment before opening it. Something about the envelope made her uneasy. The paper felt thicker than normal, rough beneath her fingertips. And there was a faint smell she couldn't quite place. Something metallic. Something familiar. Inside the envelope was a photograph. Nothing else. No note. No explanation. Just the photograph. Alina's breath caught in her throat the moment she saw it. It was an old photo. A crime scene picture. Grainy black and white. The image showed the living room of Mrs. Evelyn Carter's house. The overturned candy bowl. Chocolate scattered across the carpet. And faintly visible on the floor beside the couch. A dark shape where the first victim had fallen. Alina's hands began to shake. But that wasn't the worst part. She slowly turned the photograph over. And on the back, written in the same careful handwriting, were 3 simple words. Do you remember? Across town, another letter arrived that same morning. Then another. And another. By the afternoon, 6 people had received identical envelopes. All of them survivors. All of them people who had lived through the massacre 30 years earlier. The photographs inside each envelope were different. But they all showed something from that night. A police cruiser outside a crime scene. A shattered window. A porch light glowing above an empty doorway. Moments frozen from the darkest night Hollow Creek had ever known. And on the back of every photograph, the same words. Do you remember? At first, people assumed it was a cruel prank. Teenagers sometimes played jokes around Halloween. That wasn't unusual. But as the letters continued to arrive, the feeling in Hollow Creek began to shift. because whoever sent them knew too much. The photographs weren't available to the public. Most of them had never been released outside police records. Some of the images were so disturbing, they had been sealed away in evidence archives. Yet somehow someone had copies, and they were sending them to the exact people who had witnessed that terrible night. By October 6th, the police department was involved. Sheriff Daniel Mercer had taken the job only 2 years earlier. He was young for a sheriff, barely 40, and Hollow Creek still felt strange to him. Too quiet, too cautious, too many people who avoided certain conversations. When the letters started arriving, Mercer quickly realized something unsettling. Everyone who received one had been present during the massacre. Every single one. Which meant the sender had a list. A very specific list. The survivors began calling each other. Old wounds reopened quickly. Many of them hadn't spoken in years. Some had moved away after the massacre but returned later in life, unable to completely abandon their hometown. Others had never left at all. Now suddenly, they were all connected again by the same terrifying message. Eleanor Briggs, Mark Halstead, Linda Carver, Thomas Bell. 6 names in total. 6 people who had seen things that night. 6 people who had spent 30 years trying to forget. And now someone was reminding them. The next letter arrived 3 days later. This one was different. It appeared in the mailbox of Mark Halstead, a mechanic who owned the town's only auto shop. Mark had been a teenager during the massacre. He had seen the killer once, just for a moment, standing under a flickering street lamp. The image had followed him into adulthood. The mask. Always the mask. When Mark opened his envelope, he found another photograph inside. This one showed Hollow Creek Forest, taken from the police line the morning after the killings. The fog drifting between the trees. The place where Deputy Marcus Hale had supposedly killed the masked murderer. Mark turned the photo over slowly. The same handwriting stared back at him. But this time, the message was longer. 4 words. Lock your doors before midnight. By the end of the week, every survivor had received the same warning. Lock your doors before midnight. The message spread through Hollow Creek like wildfire. People tried to laugh it off at first, but laughter came out uneasy. Forced, because deep down, everyone understood something terrible. The letters weren't random. They were a countdown. Sheriff Mercer tried to calm the town. He called it harassment. A prank. A bored local trying to stir up old ghosts. But when Mercer examined the photographs more closely, something made his stomach twist. The pictures weren't copies. They were originals. Actual evidence photographs taken during the investigation 30 years ago. Which meant someone had access to the old police archive. Or worse, someone had taken them before they were sealed. And then another detail began to bother him. A detail no one else seemed to notice at first. The letters had been mailed from different towns across the state. Different post offices. Different days. Whoever sent them had traveled to avoid being traced. Which meant this wasn't a prank. This was planned. Carefully. Patiently. Late one evening, Eleanor Briggs sat alone in her living room staring at the photograph she had received. The image of Mrs. Carter's house lay on the coffee table. Beside it, the message stared back at her. Do you remember? She whispered something quietly into the empty room. A sentence she hadn't spoken in 30 years. The night was too quiet. Outside her window, the wind moved slowly through the trees. And for a moment, just a moment, Eleanor thought she saw something standing across the street. A tall shape. Still. watching her house. When she blinked, the street was empty again. But Alina locked her doors anyway. Every single one. Because something about the letters felt familiar. Not just the photographs. Not just the handwriting. But the feeling behind them. A feeling she had carried since the night of the massacre. A quiet certainty that the nightmare had never truly ended. And somewhere in Hollow Creek, someone was waiting for Halloween to return. Chapter 3. The town has been hiding a secret since the massacre. By the second week of October, Hollow Creek no longer felt like the quiet town it had always pretended to be. Something had shifted. It was subtle at first, conversations stopping when strangers walked into the diner, people glancing over their shoulders while collecting the morning mail, porch lights staying on longer than usual. Fear had returned. Not the loud kind. Not panic. But the slow, creeping kind that settles into a place and refuses to leave. And the letters kept coming. Sheriff Daniel Mercer spent most of his days inside the small Hollow Creek police station, surrounded by boxes of files that hadn't been opened in decades. The massacre case. Officially, it had been closed 30 years ago. Case solved. Killer deceased. But Mercer had quickly learned something unsettling. There were gaps in the files. Large ones. Entire sections missing. Witness statements that ended mid-page. Evidence logs with blank entries. And most disturbing of all, several photographs had been removed entirely. Mercer leaned back in his chair, staring at the old folder on his desk. The name printed across the tab read simply, Halloween Incident, 1996. Not massacre. Not murders. Just incident. Even the wording felt like an attempt to soften something far worse. He flipped another page. More empty spaces. Someone had removed evidence from this file. And they had done it a long time ago. Across town, Alina Briggs was beginning to feel the same unease. She sat at her kitchen table with 3 envelopes laid neatly in front of her. 3 photographs. 3 messages. Do you remember? Do you remember? Lock your doors before midnight. The letters had arrived days apart, each one tightening the knot in her stomach. But it wasn't just the letters that bothered her. It was what they were forcing her to remember. Because the truth was, the massacre had never made sense. Not even that night. 30 years earlier, the killings had happened too quickly. Too efficiently. 9 victims across town in just a few hours. Police had blamed one man. But the survivors had always felt something was wrong with that explanation. The killer had moved like someone who knew the town perfectly. Who knew where people lived. Who knew which houses would be empty and which wouldn't. And more importantly, who knew which doors would be unlocked. Alina closed her eyes. The memories came back slowly. Fragments of that night. Flashes of things she hadn't allowed herself to think about for decades. The screaming sirens. The empty streets. The strange stillness hanging in the air. And something else. Something she had never told the police. That night, around 11 o'clock, Alina had been standing by her front window. Watching the street. The entire town already felt wrong. Too quiet. She remembered seeing someone walking along the sidewalk. But it wasn't the masked man. This person wasn't wearing a mask at all. It had been a man in a dark coat. Moving quickly. Looking nervous. And when he noticed Alina watching him, he turned and disappeared between 2 houses. At the time, she had assumed he was just another frightened neighbor. But now, 30 years later, she wasn't so sure. Sheriff Mercer discovered something similar while digging through the town archives. Not police files, newspaper records, or rather, the lack of them. Mercer had visited the Hollow Creek Public Library, hoping to read old articles about the massacre. But when the librarian brought out the archives from 1996, something was immediately wrong. Entire issues of the local newspaper were missing. Not damaged, not misplaced, removed. The entire week after the massacre had vanished from the records. Mercer frowned as he flipped through the remaining pages. The headlines jumped directly from October 30th to November 8th. 9 days of history gone. The librarian, an elderly woman named Margaret Doyle, noticed his confusion. She sighed softly. "They were removed," she said. Mercer looked up. "Removed?" Margaret nodded. "Years ago, by the town council." "Why?" Margaret hesitated. Then she lowered her voice. The official explanation was to prevent outsiders from turning the tragedy into spectacle. Mercer leaned forward. "And the real reason?" Margaret met his eyes carefully. "Some stories," she said quietly, "are dangerous when people start asking questions." Mercer left the library with a growing sense of dread. Because if the town had erased records of the massacre, then they weren't just trying to protect themselves from gossip. They were hiding something. Later that evening, Mercer sat alone in his office studying one of the photographs from the letters. The one showing Hollow Creek Forest, the place where the killer had supposedly died. The fog in the image looked thick, unnatural, but something else caught his attention. At the edge of the photograph, just barely visible near the trees, there was another figure. Not the body on the ground. Someone standing behind the police tape. Watching. Mercer leaned closer. The shape was blurry, but it was definitely a person. And they were not wearing a police uniform, which meant something impossible. Someone else had been there that morning. Someone the reports never mentioned. Across town, the survivors were beginning to feel the pressure. The letters had reopened wounds that never truly healed. Old arguments resurfaced. Old accusations. Because the massacre hadn't only taken lives. It had broken friendships, destroyed trust. And now, someone was forcing them to remember everything they had buried. That night, Alina Briggs received another envelope. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a photograph unlike the others. This one showed a group of people. 6 of them, standing together outside the Hollow Creek High School gymnasium. The picture had clearly been taken before the massacre. Before everything changed. Alina recognized every face in the photograph. Because they were the survivors. Sorry. Mark Halstead, Linda Carver, Thomas Bell, and 2 others who had received letters. 6 people connected by one terrible night. She slowly turned the photograph over. Her heart pounded as she read the message written on the back. This time the handwriting was sharper, angrier, and the words sent a chill down her spine. "You know why it happened." Alina stared at the message for a long time. Then she whispered something into the darkness of her kitchen. A truth she had never spoken aloud. Not to the police. Not to anyone. Because if the letters were right, if someone truly remembered what happened that night, then the massacre hadn't been random at all. Somewhere in Hollow Creek, someone knew the truth. And that truth was about to come back. The same way the killer had. Slowly, quietly, patiently. Because in Hollow Creek, the past had never really stayed buried. And the next letter was already on its way. Chapter 4. Someone is recreating the original killings. The first new murder happened on October 12th. It was discovered just after sunrise. And the moment Sheriff Daniel Mercer saw the scene, he understood something terrible. The nightmare had begun again. The victim was Thomas Bell. For 30 years, Thomas had worked as the night janitor at Hollow Creek High School, a quiet man who kept mostly to himself. People described him as gentle, harmless, forgettable. But Thomas Bell had also been something else. A witness, one of the 6 survivors who had received the letters. And now he was the first of them to die. The body was found inside the high school gymnasium, the same gym where, decades earlier, the survivors had taken the photograph Alina Briggs had received in the mail. The irony did not escape Sheriff Mercer, nor did the horrifying detail that came next. Thomas Bell had been killed in the exact same way as the first victim of the original massacre. Mrs. Evelyn Carter. The position of the body. The overturned chair beside him. Even the scattered candy wrappers around the floor. Someone had recreated the crime scene. Perfectly. The police station filled quickly that morning. Word traveled fast in Hollow Creek. By noon, nearly everyone in town knew what had happened. The phrase began to circulate again, whispered through diners, gas stations, and quiet front porches. The killings have started again. No one said it loudly, but everyone felt it. Sheriff Mercer stood inside the gymnasium long after the forensic team had finished documenting the scene. Sunlight filtered weakly through the high windows, casting long shadows across the basketball court. The silence felt heavy, unnatural. He walked slowly toward the center of the room, studying every detail. The chair, the candy wrappers, the body outline drawn in chalk where Thomas Bell had fallen. The recreation was too precise. This wasn't random violence. This was a message. Deputy Carla Ruiz approached quietly behind him. "You noticed it too," she said. Mercer didn't turn. The similarities. Ruiz nodded. "It's identical." Mercer exhaled slowly. "The killer is copying the original murders." Ruiz folded her arms, uneasy. "But why wait 30 years?" Mercer stared at the chalk outline. "Because," he said quietly, "this was always the plan." Across town, the remaining survivors were beginning to panic. Alina Briggs heard the news before lunchtime. Mark Halstead called her from his auto shop, his voice shaking. "They found Thomas," he said. Alina already knew what he was going to say, but hearing it made her chest tighten. "How?" she asked softly. Mark hesitated. The same way it started before. There was a long silence between them. Finally, Alina whispered the words neither of them wanted to say. "It's happening again." By evening, the entire town had retreated indoors. Hollow Creek had always been quiet, but now the streets were nearly empty. Shops closed early. Children were kept inside. Even the diner shut its doors before sunset. People didn't want to be outside. Not after dark. Not anymore. Because if the first killing matched the original massacre, then everyone knew what came next. The second victim in 1996 had been found on Pine Street, 20 minutes after Mrs. Carter's death. And now the residents of Pine Street were watching their windows carefully. Waiting. Listening. Sheriff Mercer drove slowly through town that night. His patrol car headlights swept across dark houses and silent sidewalks. The radio remained quiet. Too quiet. The phrase surfaced in his mind again. The word survivors had repeated for decades. The night was too quiet. He stopped the car at the edge of Pine Street. Something about the road unsettled him. The streetlights hummed faintly overhead. Most houses were dark. but one house still had its porch light on. Mercer recognized it immediately. Mark Halstead's home. Mercer stepped out of the cruiser and walked up the driveway. Mark opened the door before he could knock. His face looked pale. "You heard about Thomas," Mark said. Mercer nodded. "Yeah." Mark glanced nervously down the street. "I figured you'd come by." Mercer studied him carefully. "You received the letters, too?" Mark hesitated before answering. "3 of them." Mercer stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of motor oil and old wood. Mark closed the door quickly behind them. "You think it's the same guy?" Mark asked. Mercer didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked toward the living room window and looked out into the street. Everything seemed still, but something about the quiet made his skin crawl. "I don't know," Mercer finally said, "but someone is following the same pattern." Mark sat heavily on the couch. "I keep thinking about that night," he admitted. "The first time this happened." Mercer turned. "What do you remember?" Mark rubbed his face slowly. "I remember seeing him." "The killer?" Mark nodded. "Under a streetlight." Mercer leaned forward. "What did he look like?" Mark swallowed. "Like a shadow." He paused before adding quietly, "But there was something strange about him." Mercer waited. Mark stared at the floor. "He wasn't rushing." "What do you mean?" Mark looked up. He walked like he had all the time in the world. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees. The branches scraped faintly against the roof. Mercer glanced toward the window again. Something shifted in the darkness across the street. A shape. Tall. Still. Standing beneath the flickering streetlight. Mercer's heart skipped. He stepped closer to the glass. The figure didn't move. Didn't react. Just stood there. Watching. "Mark," Mercer said quietly. "Come here." Mark stood and joined him at the window. The moment he saw the figure outside, his breath caught. "Oh God," he whispered. The streetlight flickered once. Twice. And for a brief moment, the face of the figure became visible. Not a face. A mask. White. Blank. Expressionless. The same mask described 30 years earlier. Mercer grabbed his radio immediately. But by the time he stepped outside, the figure was gone. The street was empty again. Only the faint hum of the streetlight remained. Mercer scanned the road carefully. Nothing. No footprints. No sound. No movement. But he knew what he had seen. And judging by the look on Mark Halstead's face, so did he. Back inside the house, Mark sank into the couch again. His hands trembled. "He's back," Mark said quietly. Mercer didn't argue, because the truth was already obvious. The killer wasn't just recreating the murders. He was returning to the same streets, the same houses, the same witnesses. And if the pattern continued, the next victim would die soon. Very soon. Mercer looked at the clock on Mark's wall. 10:17 p.m. The exact time Ryan Wilkes had seen the killer standing over Mrs. Carter's body 30 years ago. Mercer felt the weight of something dreadful settling over the town. Because if history was repeating itself, then Hollow Creek had just begun reliving its worst nightmare. And this time, the killer wasn't hiding anymore. Chapter 5. The mask appears again. After the night on Pine Street, no one in Hollow Creek slept well. Word spread quickly. Sheriff Mercer hadn't told the town exactly what he saw outside Mark Halstead's house, but rumors traveled faster than facts. Someone had seen the mask. Again, the same white, blank face described in police reports 30 years earlier. By morning, the town felt different. Not louder, not chaotic, just tense. People moved quickly between places, avoiding eye contact, as if fear itself might spread if someone looked at it too closely. The phrase returned once more, whispered in the diner, repeated at the gas station, muttered between neighbors standing on porches. The night was too quiet. Sheriff Mercer spent the early hours reviewing security footage. Hollow Creek was small, but over the years a few businesses had installed cameras. The grocery store, the pharmacy, a bank on Main Street. Mercer and Deputy Ruiz sat in the dimly lit office, staring at a computer monitor filled with grainy black and white footage. Hours of it. Most of it showed nothing but empty sidewalks and drifting leaves. Then at 9:52 p.m. something appeared. A figure, walking slowly past the grocery store. Mercer leaned forward. Pause it. Ruiz froze the frame. The image sharpened slightly. The figure was tall, broad-shouldered, and the face. Ruiz felt her stomach tighten. That's the mask, she whispered. Mercer didn't answer immediately. He stared at the still frame, studying the posture of the figure. Something about it felt familiar. Not just the mask. The way the person moved. Slow, confident, like someone who knew exactly where they were going. They rewound the footage, played it again, this time watching carefully. The figure passed the grocery store at 9:52. 2 minutes later, another camera captured him turning onto Pine Street, heading directly toward Mark Halstead's house. The timing was too precise to ignore. Whoever this is, Ruiz said quietly, they knew Mark would be there. Mercer nodded slowly. That's not the scary part. Ruiz looked at him. The scary part is they wanted him to see the mask. Across town, the remaining survivors had begun calling each other again. Fear had erased the years of distance between them. Old resentments no longer mattered. Now there was only one question on everyone's mind. Who was behind the mask? Alina Briggs sat at her kitchen table, listening to the phone ring. She had dialed Linda Carver 3 times before Linda finally answered. Linda's voice sounded strained. You heard about Thomas, Linda said. Alina nodded, even though Linda couldn't see her. Yes. And Mark saw something last night. I know. Linda exhaled slowly. I think we need to talk. 2 hours later, the 4 remaining survivors gathered inside Alina's house. Alina Briggs, Mark Halstead, Linda Carver, and Samuel Pike, a retired history teacher who had been one of the first witnesses during the massacre. The room felt heavy with unease. No one wanted to speak first. Finally, Mark broke the silence. I saw him, he said. The others looked at him. The mask, Mark continued. Exactly the same. Samuel Pike shook his head slowly. That's impossible. Mark's voice rose slightly. I know what I saw. Alina studied the photograph lying on the table between them. The one showing the 6 survivors standing together outside the high school gymnasium. Thomas Bell's smiling face stared back at them. Now he was gone. And someone had chosen him first. Linda spoke quietly. They're following the same order. Everyone turned toward her. What do you mean? Samuel asked. Linda pointed at the photograph. In the original massacre, Mrs. Carter died first. She paused. And Thomas Bell was the first witness to find one of the bodies. The room grew colder. Mark frowned. You think that's why he was killed first? Linda nodded. Yes. Samuel swallowed uneasily. Then who comes next? No one answered, because all of them were silently doing the same math, trying to remember the order of that terrible night, trying to guess who the killer would choose next. Outside Eliner's house, the sun had begun to set. Shadows stretched across the quiet street, and somewhere far off in the distance, a dog began barking. The sound echoed strangely through the neighborhood, then stopped abruptly. Later that night, Sheriff Mercer received another call. This one came from the Hollow Creek Pharmacy. The night clerk had reported something strange on the security cameras. Mercer arrived within minutes. The clerk, a nervous college student named Danny, pointed at the monitor. "I saw him again," Danny said. Mercer leaned toward the screen. The footage showed the sidewalk outside the pharmacy. Empty. Still. Then, from the left edge of the frame, the figure appeared, walking slowly beneath the streetlights. The mask glowed pale under the camera's glare. Mercer studied the footage carefully. The figure stopped directly beneath the pharmacy's front window. And then something disturbing happened. The masked man turned, looked directly into the camera, and raised one hand slowly. Not waving, not threatening, just acknowledging it, as if he knew someone was watching. Danny's voice trembled. He stood there for almost 2 minutes. Mercer frowned. Then what happened? Danny swallowed. He walked away. Mercer replayed the footage several times. The movement of the masked figure felt deliberate, controlled, like someone performing a role, someone who wanted to be seen. And that realization chilled Mercer more than anything else, because killers usually tried to hide. This one didn't. This one wanted attention. That night, the survivors locked themselves inside their homes. Every door, every window. Lights stayed on long after midnight. But sleep refused to come, because now they knew something for certain. The mask wasn't just a memory anymore. It was real, walking the streets again. And somewhere in Hollow Creek, the person behind that mask was carefully watching the survivors, waiting, planning, counting, because if Linda Carver was right, then the next killing wasn't random. It was scheduled, and the killer already knew who would die next. Chapter 6. The survivors begin turning on each other. Fear does strange things to people. At first, it brings them together. But if it lingers long enough, it begins to tear them apart. That was exactly what was happening to the survivors of Hollow Creek. After Thomas Bell's death and the sightings of the mask, something fragile inside their small group began to fracture. Trust. It had survived 30 years of silence. But now it was crumbling. 3 days passed without another killing. The town remained tense, waiting for the next attack. Every night, people locked their doors before sunset. Every sound outside made someone peek nervously through their curtains. But the killer didn't strike again. Not yet. And that silence made things worse, because it gave people time to think, to remember, to question. The 4 remaining survivors gathered again at Alina Briggs' house. The meeting felt different this time. Less like a reunion, more like an interrogation. Mark Halstead paced the living room, running a hand through his hair. "I keep thinking about the letters," he said. "The message on the last one." Alina looked up from the kitchen table. "You mean the one that said you know why it happened?" Mark nodded. Samuel Pike sat stiffly in an armchair near the window. "That doesn't mean anything," Samuel insisted. "It's just psychological manipulation." But Linda Carver didn't look convinced. No, she said quietly. I think it means exactly what it says. Everyone turned toward her. Linda folded her arms slowly. Think about it, she continued. The killings 30 years ago, they never made sense. Mark frowned. What are you saying? Linda hesitated before answering. I'm saying maybe the massacre wasn't random. Samuel scoffed. 9 people were murdered. Yes, Linda replied calmly. But all 9 of them had something in common. Silence filled the room. Alina felt a cold weight settle in her chest. What do you mean? She asked. Linda glanced at the photograph on the table again. The picture of the 6 survivors. Every victim that night, she said slowly, had some connection to us. The statement hung in the air like smoke. Mark stopped packing. That's ridiculous. Linda shook her head. Is it? She leaned forward. Mrs. Carter used to tutor you in high school, Mark. Mark blinked. What does that have to do with anything? Linda continued. And the second victim, David Larkin, he worked at Samuel's bookstore. Samuel shifted uncomfortably. That's coincidence. Linda didn't stop. The third victim lived next door to Alina. Alina felt her throat tighten. And the fourth was the gym coach who supervised the school dance the night before the massacre. Mark's voice dropped. So, Linda looked at all of them carefully. They were all there that night. Alina felt the room tilt slightly. You mean the dance? Linda nodded. Yes. The Halloween dance at Hollow Creek High School. October 30th, 1996. The night before the killings began. All 6 survivors had attended. So had the victims. It had been the last normal night the town ever had. Samuel leaned forward sharply. You're reaching, he said. That dance had hundreds of people. Linda shook her head slowly. But something happened after the dance. Mark stared at her. What are you talking about? Linda hesitated. For 30 years, she had never said it aloud. But the letters had reopened something she could no longer ignore. You remember Michael Crowley, she said quietly. The name landed like a stone. Michael Crowley. The strange boy. The quiet one who rarely spoke to anyone. The one people used to mock behind his back. Mark shifted uneasily. What about him? Linda looked directly at Alina. You remember what happened that night? Alina's stomach twisted. Because she did remember. Everyone in that room did. But no one had talked about it in decades. The dance had ended late. Most students had gone home. But a small group had stayed behind near the gymnasium parking lot. The survivors. And Michael Crowley. Mark rubbed the back of his neck. That was just stupid teenage stuff. Linda's voice hardened. It wasn't just that. Samuel raised his hand. Enough. But Linda wasn't finished. You chased him into the woods, she said. The room went silent. Alina's heart pounded. The memory came rushing back. The laughter. The shouting. Michael Crowley running into the trees. Terrified. Mark's voice trembled slightly. That wasn't serious. Linda stared at him. Maybe not for you. Alina whispered the question none of them wanted answered. What happened to him? No one responded immediately. Because the truth was simple. They didn't know. Michael Crowley had disappeared that night. The town assumed he had run away. The police searched briefly but found nothing. And eventually, people stopped asking. Samuel finally spoke. That has nothing to do with the massacre. Linda looked at him carefully. Are you sure? Samuel hesitated. Then he said something that made everyone uneasy. What if someone thought it did? Outside, the wind rattled the windows softly. The house creaked in the growing darkness. And suddenly, Alina realized something terrifying. The letters had always been directed at the survivors. Not the town. Not the police. Just them. Mark looked around the room slowly. You think someone is killing us because of Michael Crowley. Linda didn't answer, but her silence said everything. Samuel stood abruptly. This is insane. But even as he spoke, his eyes drifted nervously toward the window, as if expecting to see someone standing there. Watching. Listening. Waiting. Because if Linda was right, if the massacre 30 years ago had been revenge, then the killer had never been targeting the town. He had been targeting them all along. And now there were only 4 survivors left. 4 people who knew the truth about that night in the woods. 4 people who might finally understand why the letters had arrived. But there was one question none of them had asked yet. One question that lingered like a shadow over the room. Alina finally whispered it. Who found Michael Crowley after we chased him into the forest? No one answered. Because deep down, they all knew the horrifying possibility. What if someone had? And what if that person had been waiting 30 years to make them pay? Chapter 7. The truth about the body they buried. The past rarely stays buried forever. Sometimes it waits quietly beneath the surface, like roots spreading through the soil. And sometimes someone digs it back up. Sheriff Daniel Mercer stood alone inside the Hollow Creek Courthouse archive room, surrounded by old boxes that smelled faintly of dust and mildew. The room hadn't been touched in years. Most of the town's official records were stored digitally now. But the older files, the ones no one liked to talk about, were still kept here. Locked away. Forgotten. Or at least that was the idea. Mercer had been searching for hours. He was looking for one specific document. The original coroner's report from the night the killer supposedly died. The report wasn't in the police file. That had bothered Mercer immediately. If the case had truly been closed, the autopsy report should have been attached to the evidence records. But it was, which meant someone had removed it. And Mercer had a growing suspicion about why. Finally, buried in a box labeled Medical Records, 1996, Mercer found what he was looking for. The paper was yellowed with age. The ink slightly faded. But the name on the report was still clearly visible. Unidentified male, Halloween incident. Mercer began reading. At first, everything seemed normal. Estimated age. Approximate height. Physical injuries sustained during the confrontation with Deputy Marcus Hale. But halfway down the page, Mercer noticed something strange. A handwritten note. Not part of the original report. Added later. He leaned closer to read it, and his stomach tightened. The note read, facial structure inconsistent with witness descriptions, possible misidentification. Mercer frowned. He flipped back through the earlier pages of the police report. Every witness statement described the killer the same way. Tall, broad-shouldered, athletic build. But the autopsy described the body differently. Shorter, thinner, nearly 30 pounds lighter than what witnesses had estimated. Mercer whispered to himself, "That's not the same man." A second detail disturbed him even more. The report listed several old injuries on the body. Broken fingers, a healed rib fracture, scars along the forearms. But none of those injuries appeared in the witness descriptions of the killer. Meaning one terrifying thing. The man buried in Hollow Creek Cemetery might not have been the masked killer at all. Mercer leaned back slowly in his chair. The realization crawled through his mind like ice. 30 years ago, the town had declared the killer dead. But the evidence suggested something else entirely. The wrong man had been buried. Across town, Eleanor Briggs was struggling with the same terrible thought. She sat alone in her living room, staring at the photograph of the survivors again. 6 smiling faces from 30 years ago. Now only 4 remained alive. Thomas Bell was dead, and the killings were following the same order as before, which meant the next victim could come at any moment. Her phone rang suddenly. The sound made her jump. She answered quickly. "Hello." Sheriff Mercer's voice came through the line. "Eleanor, I need to ask you something." His tone was serious. "Urgent." Eleanor's chest tightened. "What is it?" Mercer hesitated before speaking. "Do you remember the body they found in the woods?" Eleanor blinked. "Of course. Did you see it?" She shook her head automatically. "No, the police never let anyone near it." There was a long pause. Then Mercer said something that made her grip the phone harder. "I don't think that body was the killer." The silence between them stretched. Finally, Eleanor whispered, "What do you mean?" Mercer explained the coroner's report. The injuries, the mismatched description, the possibility that the wrong man had been buried. When he finished speaking, Eleanor felt like the room had grown colder. "If that's true," she said slowly, "then the real killer never died." Mercer nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "That's exactly what I'm thinking." Eleanor swallowed hard. "Then who was the man they buried?" Mercer exhaled slowly. "That's the question." At that exact moment, another discovery was being made across town. Deputy Carla Ruiz had been reviewing the old police photographs again. One image in particular kept bothering her. The photograph from Hollow Creek Forest. The one taken the morning after the massacre. The one showing the police tape and the body lying on the ground. Ruiz zoomed in carefully on the image. Toward the background. Toward the figure standing behind the police line. The person who didn't belong. The picture sharpened slightly as she enhanced the image. And suddenly, she could see the face more clearly. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough to recognize something strange. The person in the background wasn't looking at the body. They were looking directly at the camera. Ruiz felt a chill run down her spine. Because whoever that person was, they weren't a police officer. They weren't a witness. They were just standing there, watching the scene, as if they already knew what had happened. She printed the image and rushed to Mercer's office. When she arrived, Mercer was already on the phone with Eleanor. Ruiz waited until he finished. Then she placed the photograph on his desk. "You need to see this." Mercer studied the image carefully. His eyes narrowed. "That's from the crime scene." Ruiz nodded. "Look behind the tape." Mercer leaned closer. And then he saw it. The man standing in the fog, watching the scene calmly, almost curiously. Mercer felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "Who is that?" Ruiz shook her head. "No one from the department recognizes him." Mercer stared at the figure for a long moment. Then something even more disturbing occurred to him. What if he wasn't just watching? Ruiz frowned. "What do you mean?" Mercer tapped the photograph slowly. "What if he was waiting?" Outside, the wind began to pick up. Branches scraped against windows across Hollow Creek. The town felt restless, uneasy, as if something buried long ago had begun to stir again. Mercer leaned back in his chair. If the killer didn't die in those woods. Ruiz finished the thought quietly. Then he walked away. Mercer nodded. And he's been alive this entire time. 30 years. 30 years of silence. 30 years of waiting. And now the killings had started again. Mercer stared at the photograph one more time. The figure in the fog, standing calmly behind the police line, watching the chaos unfold, almost like someone admiring their work. And for the first time since reopening the case, Sheriff Mercer understood something truly horrifying. The killer hadn't just survived that night. He had escaped, which meant the masked figure walking through Hollow Creek now might not be a copycat at all. It might be the same man who started everything. Chapter 8. Halloween night returns. By the time October 31st arrived, Hollow Creek had already begun shutting itself down. No decorations hung from porches. No children walked the streets in costumes. No laughter echoed between houses. Halloween had become something else entirely. A warning. The morning sky hung low and gray, the kind of heavy autumn sky that seemed to press down on the town. Wind pushed dry leaves through the empty streets. Shop windows had already been boarded up in some places. Others simply locked their doors and hung small handwritten signs. Closed for the night. People moved quickly, finishing errands before noon. By afternoon, the town looked half deserted. The annual Halloween parade had been canceled. The school closed early. Even the diner on Main Street shut its doors before sunset. Because everyone in Hollow Creek knew what day it was. And what had happened the last time Halloween fell on a Thursday. 30 years ago. Sheriff Mercer stood outside the police station watching the sky darken. Deputy Ruiz joined him on the steps. "You think it'll happen tonight?" she asked. Mercer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched the wind push leaves across the empty road. "It already started," he said quietly. Ruiz nodded. Thomas Bell had been the first victim. Just like Mrs. Carter had been the first in 1996. The pattern had begun, which meant tonight might finish it. Across town, the remaining survivors gathered at Eleanor Briggs' house. They had agreed earlier that day it would be safer to stay together. One house. 4 people. Locked doors. Curtains closed. Mark Halstead arrived first. Then Samuel Pike. Linda Carver came last, her car pulling quickly into the driveway just before sunset. The air inside Eleanor's house felt thick with tension. Everyone moved quietly, like they were afraid the walls might be listening. Eleanor placed a kettle on the stove. The familiar routine helped steady her nerves. "We'll be fine," she said softly. Mark stood by the window, peering through the curtains. That's what people thought 30 years ago, too. No one responded, because they all knew he was right. The house was prepared carefully. Every door locked. Every window secured. Lights left on in every room. Mark had even brought a shotgun from his truck. It rested beside the couch. Samuel noticed it immediately. "You think that'll help?" he asked. Mark shrugged. "It'll make me feel better." Samuel said nothing more. The hours passed slowly. Outside, Hollow Creek grew darker. The streetlights flickered on one by one. But there were no cars. No pedestrians. No sounds except the wind moving through the trees. The entire town had sealed itself indoors. Inside the house, the survivors tried to talk about ordinary things. But every conversation drifted back to the same subject. The massacre. The letters. Michael Crowley. Linda stared into her coffee cup. If this really is about what happened in the woods, She didn't finish the sentence, but the others understood. Samuel broke the silence. "We were kids," he said defensively. "It wasn't supposed to go that far." Mark looked at him. "But it did." Elena closed her eyes briefly. The memory of that night had never truly faded. Michael Crowley running through the trees. The flashlight beams bouncing between branches. The laughter that slowly turned uneasy. And then, the screaming. None of them had followed him into the forest after that. They had run home instead. Frightened, confused, convinced the boy had simply gotten lost in the woods. The police search the next day had found nothing. No body, no footprints, no sign of Michael Crowley ever leaving the forest. Eventually, the town stopped looking. But now the past had returned. The clock on Eleanor's wall ticked loudly. 9:17 p.m. Each passing minute seemed heavier than the last. Mark checked the shotgun again. Linda paced near the kitchen. Samuel sat rigidly in his chair. Eleanor tried to breathe slowly. "We just have to make it through the night," she whispered. At 10:04 p.m. the lights flickered. Everyone froze. The house went dark for half a second. Then the electricity returned. Samuel forced a nervous laugh. Probably the wind. But no one looked convinced. The clock ticked forward. 10:16 p.m. Mark stood by the window again. The street outside looked completely empty. The same stillness Mercer had described days earlier. Too quiet. Then something moved. At first it looked like nothing more than a shadow crossing the street. But as Mark leaned closer to the glass, the shape became clearer. A tall figure walking slowly toward the house. Mark's breath caught in his throat. "Oh God!" Everyone turned toward him. "What is it?" Eleanor asked. Mark didn't answer. He simply stepped back from the window and whispered two words. "He's here." Samuel rushed to the window. For a moment he saw nothing. Then the streetlight flickered, and the figure stepped directly beneath it. The mask gleamed pale under the yellow glow. White, blank, expressionless. Linda gasped. Eleanor gripped the edge of the table. The figure stood motionless in the street, just like witnesses had described 30 years earlier. Watching, waiting. Mark grabbed the shotgun. "Stay away from the windows." The figure didn't move. Minutes passed. No one inside the house spoke. The silence pressed in around them. Then something unexpected happened. The masked figure slowly raised one hand and pointed directly at the house. Samuel whispered, "What does that mean?" No one answered, because the message was obvious. The killer wasn't hiding. He was announcing himself. Then the front door rattled. Once, hard. Everyone jumped. The handle twisted violently. Mark lifted the shotgun. Back away from the door. The rattling stopped. The house fell silent again. Then came the knock. 3 slow knocks. Heavy, deliberate, echoing through the quiet hallway. No one moved. No one breathed. Outside the door, the masked killer waited. And then a voice spoke from the other side. Calm, quiet, almost patient. A voice none of them had heard in 30 years. But somehow, all of them recognized. "Do you remember me?" Chapter 9. The mask finally comes off. For several seconds, no one inside the house moved. The voice from the other side of the door echoed faintly through the hallway. Calm, patient, almost polite. "Do you remember me?" The words hung in the air like a cold breath. Elena felt her hands trembling. Mark tightened his grip on the shotgun. Samuel stared at the door as if it might explode inward at any second. And Linda Carver slowly whispered the name none of them had dared say aloud in decades. Michael. The house was silent again. Outside, the wind pushed leaves across the empty street. The masked figure remained unseen behind the door. But everyone inside could feel his presence. Waiting. Listening. Mark stepped toward the door cautiously. "Stay back," he said to the others. His voice sounded stronger than he felt. The memory of the mask under the streetlight still burned in his mind. 30 years. 30 years, and the same nightmare had returned. The doorknob turned slowly. Not violently this time. Just a quiet twist. Then the door creaked open. The figure stepped inside. He was tall, just like the witnesses had described all those years ago. The white mask covered his face completely, smooth and blank, with dark eye holes that swallowed the light. He wore a dark coat, damp from the cold night air. And in one hand, he held a long hunting knife. The blade glinted faintly under the ceiling lights. Mark raised the shotgun immediately. "Stop right there." The masked man obeyed. He stopped in the center of the hallway. Calm, unhurried, as if he had expected this moment. Linda's voice trembled. "Michael, is that really you?" The masked man tilted his head slightly. Then he spoke again. "Yes." The word came softly, but it struck the room like thunder. Samuel shook his head in disbelief. "That's impossible." But deep down, all of them already knew the truth. Because the voice belonged to someone they had once known. Someone they had once chased into the woods. Someone they had once abandoned. Michael Crowley slowly reached up and touched the edge of the mask. For a moment, no one breathed. Then he lifted it away. The face beneath was pale and scarred. Older, of course. 30 years had carved deep lines across his skin. But the eyes were unmistakable. Dark, cold, and filled with something that had been growing for decades. Hatred. Elena covered her mouth. "Oh my God." Michael studied each of them carefully. His gaze moved slowly from one face to another. "You remember now," he said quietly. Mark lowered the shotgun slightly. "Michael, we thought you died." Michael smiled faintly. "A lot of people thought that." His voice was calm, almost conversational, as if they were discussing something ordinary. But the knife in his hand never moved. Samuel swallowed hard. "What happened to you?" Michael's eyes drifted toward the window, toward the dark forest beyond the town. "You chased me into those woods," he said. "I ran for hours." His voice remained steady. But the forest wasn't empty. No one spoke. Michael continued. "I fell down a ravine." He tapped the scar across his cheek. "That's where this came from." Linda felt tears forming in her eyes. "We were kids," she whispered. Michael looked at her. "You were bullies." The room fell silent again. Michael took a slow step forward. Mark lifted the shotgun again instinctively. "Don't move." Michael stopped. But he didn't look frightened. Not even slightly. "I waited a long time," Michael said softly. 30 years. He glanced toward the photograph on the table. The picture of the 6 survivors. "You grew up," he continued. "Built lives. Families. Careers." Then his voice hardened slightly. "But you never paid for what you did." Eleanor's voice cracked. "Michael, we didn't know you were hurt." Michael's expression darkened. "You heard me screaming. The words cut through the room like a blade. And you ran away. Samuel tried to step forward. Listen to me. The knife flashed suddenly. Samuel froze. Michael hadn't struck him. But the warning was clear. Don't, Michael said calmly. Mark spoke again, his voice shaking. So you killed 9 people. Michael tilted his head. Did I? Mark stared at him. You're wearing the mask. Michael smiled slightly. Yes. Then he said something that made Aliner's heart drop. But the first massacre wasn't revenge. Confusion rippled through the room. Linda frowned. What do you mean? Michael glanced toward the window again. The man you buried that night. He paused. Wasn't me. Sheriff Mercer's discovery echoed suddenly in Aliner's mind. The wrong body. The wrong killer. Michael continued quietly. The original killer was someone else. Someone who found me in the woods. Aliner's voice barely escaped her lips. Who? Michael's eyes darkened. He saved my life. Silence filled the room again. But he was already broken, Michael said. He told me about Hollow Creek. About the people who deserved punishment. Michael looked directly at the survivors. And I helped him. Mark stared at him in horror. You mean? Michael nodded slowly. Yes. The massacre 30 years ago. We did it together. The realization hit them all at once. 2 killers. Not one. One of them buried. The other alive. Waiting. Michael raised the mask again slowly. But he died in the woods. His voice remained calm. So the rest of the work became mine. Mark tightened his grip on the shotgun. You're insane. Michael looked at him. No. He slipped the mask back over his face. I'm patient. Then he stepped forward. And the nightmare of Hollow Creek reached its final moment. Chapter 10. The night the town locked its doors forever. For a moment, the entire house felt frozen in time. Michael Crowley stood in the hallway wearing the white mask again, the hunting knife hanging loosely in his hand. Across from him, Mark Halstead held the shotgun with trembling arms. Linda Carver pressed herself against the kitchen counter, her eyes wide with terror. Samuel Pike stood near the living room doorway, barely breathing. And Alina Briggs felt as though the air in the room had grown impossibly heavy. 30 years. 30 years of silence had led to this moment. Michael took another slow step forward. The floor creaked beneath his boots. Mark lifted the shotgun higher. Don't move. Michael stopped again. But the mask tilted slightly, almost like he was amused. You still think you're in control, he said quietly. Mark's voice shook. I'm serious. Michael didn't respond. He simply raised the knife slightly, letting the blade catch the light. Outside, the wind howled softly through the trees. The branches scraped against the house like fingernails across wood. Inside, the tension in the room had become unbearable. Alina felt the same memory clawing its way through her mind again. The forest. Michael screaming in the darkness. And the moment they had all turned and run away. Michael, she whispered. The masked figure didn't look at her. You could still stop this. He slowly turned his head toward her. For 30 years, he said calmly, I waited for one of you to say that. Alina felt tears forming in her eyes. We were kids. Michael took another step closer. And now you're adults. Mark's finger tightened on the trigger. That's close enough. Michael stopped just a few feet away. For several seconds, the 2 men simply stared at each other. Then Michael said something unexpected. You were the one who started it. Mark blinked. What? The chase. Michael's voice remained steady. You threw the first rock. Mark's face turned pale. That was a joke. Michael tilted his head again. A joke that sent me running into the forest. Samuel finally spoke. We didn't know you, Fall. Michael looked toward him slowly. You didn't come back to check. Samuel had no answer. Silence filled the house again. Then something changed. Michael lowered the knife slightly. His voice softened just a little. Do you know what the forest felt like that night? No one responded. It was cold, he continued. Dark. And I couldn't walk. He tapped his leg slowly. I lay there for hours. Listening. Linda whispered, listening to what? Michael's voice dropped to a near whisper. To you. Everyone froze. I heard you leaving, Michael said. Laughing. No one came back. Mark's hands were shaking now. I thought you ran away. Michael shrugged slightly. That's what the town believed too. He glanced toward the window again. But someone did find me. The story they had just heard hours earlier now returned in terrifying clarity. The man in the woods. The real killer. The one who had started the massacre. The one who had died instead. Michael raised the knife again slowly. He taught me something important. Mark swallowed hard. What? Michael's voice hardened. That patience is stronger than anger. Then everything happened at once. Mark fired. The shotgun blast exploded through the house like thunder. Michael staggered backward. The force of the shot threw him against the hallway wall. The knife clattered across the floor. For a moment, no one moved. Smoke drifted slowly through the air. Michael slid down the wall. The mask cracked as his head struck the wood behind him. Mark stared at the body in shock. His hand still gripped the shotgun. Is he? Linda slowly stepped forward. Michael's chest moved once. Twice. Then stopped. The nightmare had finally ended. But the silence afterward felt strange. Not peaceful. Just empty. Minutes later, police sirens echoed through Hollow Creek. Sheriff Mercer rushed into the house with Deputy Ruiz close behind him. They stopped when they saw the scene. Michael Crowley lying motionless on the floor. The cracked mask beside him. The survivors standing in stunned silence. Mercer approached carefully. He knelt beside the body and checked for a pulse. There was none. After 30 years, the killer was finally dead. Outside, the town slowly began to stir. Lights turned on in houses. Doors opened cautiously. People stepped outside for the first time that night. The news spread quickly. The killer had been stopped. The nightmare was over. But Hollow Creek would never be the same again. The truth about the massacre finally surfaced. 2 killers. One buried. One waiting 30 years for revenge. And a terrible secret the survivors had carried all that time. In the weeks that followed, the town changed. Old records were reopened. Newspaper archives were restored. The real story of Halloween night finally became public. For the first time in decades, people spoke openly about what had happened. But one thing never changed. Every Halloween night, before the sun went down, the people of Hollow Creek still locked their doors. Not because Michael Crowley might return, but because they had learned something far more frightening. Some nights never truly end. Some memories never stop whispering. And some mistakes echo through generations. Long after the police cars left. Long after the town fell silent again. The cracked white mask lay sealed inside the Hollow Creek evidence locker. A reminder of the night everything finally came to light. And every year, when October returned, someone in Hollow Creek would inevitably whisper the same old sentence. The one survivors had repeated for 30 years. The one that still made people glance nervously at the dark streets outside. The night is too quiet.
Closing chapter.
The people of Hollow Creek believed they could bury the past. They believed that if they locked their doors, erased the records, and never spoke about that Halloween night again, the nightmare would stay buried. But evil doesn't disappear. It waits. It remembers. And sometimes it comes back exactly 30 years later. The truth is, the killer wasn't the only monster in Hollow Creek. The real horror began with the secret the survivors tried to hide. Because when guilt is buried long enough, it grows teeth. So remember this the next time someone tells you to forget the past. Some stories refuse to stay buried. Some nights never truly end. And sometimes, the door you locked isn't strong enough to keep what's coming out. If you made it through this story, make sure you subscribe, because the next horror audiobook might be even darker. And tonight, before you sleep, you might want to check your door, just to make sure it's locked.